Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world that doesn't fully know it's becoming history yet. You're standing barefoot on cool stone near the edge of the Aegean Sea, waves breathing in and out like they're already practicing for ASMR. The air smells faintly of salt, smoke, and something herbal you can't quite name. Somewhere behind you, a fire crackles. Somewhere ahead, the future of an entire civilization is stretching and yawning, not yet aware it's about to leave a massive footprint on the human story. You probably won't survive this bedtime story awake, fair warning. Your eyelids are already negotiating a ceasefire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And also comment your location and your local time. It's always satisfying to see from where are you tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin long before marble temples and philosophical arguments. You begin in a softer, blurrier Greece, one that historians still argue whether to call Greek at all. Around 3000 BCE, you're moving through the Bronze Age Aegean world, hopping between islands like Crete, Naxos, and tiny rocky outcrops that barely deserve a name. You don't have a unified identity yet. You have pottery styles, trade routes, and shared anxieties about the sea. The sea is everything to you. It feeds you, connects you, and occasionally reminds you who's in charge by swallowing ships whole. On Crete, you sense something different. The Minoans are here, though they don't call themselves that. That name comes much later, from a myth about King Minos and a very bad maze situation. But right now, you're just noticing their colorful frescoes, their open palaces without defensive walls, and a society that seems strangely relaxed for the ancient world. A mainstream historical fact slips quietly into your half-asleep mind. The Palace of Knossos is one of the earliest complex centers in Europe, complete with advanced drainage systems. Indoor plumbing, thousands of years before it becomes a bragging point again. You imagine ancient engineers nodding smugly. You walk through wide courtyards where bulls are everywhere, painted, carved, leaping through the air in ritual games that look exhilarating and mildly terrifying. There's a fringe tidbit that floats past you like a dream fragment. Some scholars think these bull-leaping rituals weren't just sport, but religious performances tied to fertility and cosmic balance. Others think they were just adrenaline junkies with excellent art skills. Historians still argue whether the famous labyrinth myth reflects an actual palace layout or is a symbolic memory distorted by time. You don't stay comfortable for long. Somewhere around 1600 BCE, the ground itself rebels. The volcanic eruption of Thera-modern Santorini explodes, with a force you feel even if you're not there. Ash darkens skies, tsunamis rewrite coastlines, and trade networks shudder. This isn't the end of the Minoans. Not immediately, but it's the beginning of instability. You feel it in the way conversations quiet when the earth trembles, in the way ships hesitate before setting sail again. As centuries drift by, you notice new people arriving from the mainland. They speak a harsher-sounding Greek, carry bigger weapons, and build fortresses instead of open palaces. These are the Mycenaeans, and even though their story will dominate later, right now they're just shadows at the edge of your awareness. You're still in the prelude, the part most bedtime stories skip because it's too complicated. But you're staying. You're listening. You start to understand that myth and history aren't enemies here, they're roommates sharing the same cluttered apartment. Gods aren't distant abstractions. They're weather, luck, illness, and that weird feeling you get when you know you shouldn't have taken that path home. You don't yet have Zeus on a throne, throwing lightning for fun. You have spirits in caves, sacred peaks and springs that whisper warnings if you're quiet enough. Religion is intimate, local, and deeply practical. You pray for calm seas, healthy children, and for the roof not to collapse during the next earthquake. Another Scholarly debate drifts through your mind like background radio static. Historians still argue whether early Greek religion developed independently or absorbed heavily from Near Eastern cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia. You don't care much right now. You're too busy watching smoke rise from a hilltop shrine as someone offers oil grain in a hope they don't say out loud. As you move forward in time, you notice something subtle but important. Memory matters here. Stories are repeated, refined, and rhythmically shaped, so they're easy to remember. You don't write much down yet. Writing exists linear A, linear B, but it's for administrators, not dreamers. The real archive is the human voice. Around fires, elders, recount ancestors, monsters, and voyages. Some of these stories will eventually become myths you recognize instantly. Others will vanish completely, lost like footprints at low tide. There's a quirky little detail that sneaks in as you get sleepier. Archaeologists have found that some early Aegean people used mixtures of olive oil and ash as a kind of primitive sunscreen. Yes, sunscreen. Imagine explaining that to someone who thinks ancient people just roasted quietly in the sun without complaint. You smirk, then yawn. You sense that all of this, the islands, the palaces, the myths, half-formed, is fragile. There's no empire yet, no grand political idea called Greece. There are just communities learning, forgetting, borrowing, and improvising. And somehow, in this quiet uncertainty, the foundations are being laid for democracy, philosophy, theater, and arguments that will last longer than the buildings themselves. Your breathing slows as the sea keeps time for you. The world you're standing in doesn't know what it's about to become, and that's okay. Neither do you, really. For now, it's enough to drift here, between myth and memory, letting the earliest whispers of the Greek world lull you closer to sleep. You don't wake up so much as you drift forward, carried by a slow current of time that thickens and darkens. The island calm you remember begins to feel distant, replaced by the heavy presence of stone walls and the metallic taste of iron in the air. You're on the Greek mainland now, sometime around 1600 to 1200 BCE, and the world has grown louder. Hooves strike packed earth, shields clatter. Somewhere nearby, a bard clears his throat, ready to turn violence into verse. You're standing outside a Mycenaean citadel, and it looms above you like a clenched fist. These people don't trust open courtyards or gentle horizons. They build high, thick walls made of massive stones, so large that later Greeks will swear only giants, cyclopes, could have moved them. That's not metaphor, by the way. A mainstream historical fact slides in quietly. Mycenaean fortifications at places like Mycenae and Tiryns are genuinely called Cyclopean walls because of their sheer size. You run your hand along the stone and feel how cold and permanent it seems, as if it expects to outlast you. Inside the walls, life is rigid and hierarchical. You sense the presence of a Wainax, a king whose authority flows downward through layers of officials, scribes, and warriors. This isn't democracy. This isn't debate. This is power made visible through bronze armor, chariots, and storage rooms stacked with grain and oil. You notice tablets marked with strange symbols linear B used to track rations, livestock, and offerings to the gods. It's writing, yes, but it's dry and administrative. No poetry here, no philosophy yet, just accounting and control. Still, stories leak through the cracks. You hear names that feel familiar even if they haven't solidified yet. Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles. They aren't legends yet. They're reputations, whispered and exaggerated each time they're retold. The Trojan War hangs over everything, like a half-remembered dream. Historians still argue whether it was a single conflict, a series of raids, or a poetic compression of generations of warfare. You don't need a clear answer. What matters is that everyone believes something happened. Across the sea, something worth singing about. You move through a megaron, the great hall at the center of the palace. A fire burns in a circular hearth. Smoke rises through an opening in the roof, carrying with it the smell of roasting meat and ambition. Feasts here are political theater. Who sits closest to the king matters. Who gets the best cut of meat matters. Loyalty is rewarded publicly, and betrayal is remembered forever. You sip watered wine and feel how easy it would be to say the wrong thing. There's a quirky tidbit that drifts by as your eyes grow heavy. Mycenaean boars' tusk helmets were real, made by stitching together slivers of ivory onto a leather cap. Homer will later describe them in loving detail, and for a long time scholars thought he was embellishing. Archaeology proved him right. Sometimes the poems remember better than textbooks. Beyond the walls, the world feels less secure. Farmers work fields, knowing that protection depends entirely on the mood and strength of the palace above them. Trade networks stretch far amber from the Baltic, tin from distant lands, but they're fragile. A missed shipment, a failed harvest, a restless neighbor, and everything wobbles. You sense tension everywhere, like a string pulled too tight. Religion here is formal and transactional. You offer to the gods so they don't ruin you. Zeus exists, but he's not yet the bearded sky father you picture. He's a name on a tablet, a recipient of oil and grain. Poseidon, interestingly, appears more frequently in early records, perhaps feared more as an earthshaker than a sea god. Historians still argue whether this reflects a time when earthquakes felt more immediate than storms, or just local priorities frozen in clay. Then, slowly at first, the system begins to crack. Around 1200 BCE, things start going wrong everywhere, not just here. Palaces burn, trade routes collapse, writing disappears. This isn't a gentle decline, it's a hard stop. The Bronze Age collapse rolls through the eastern Mediterranean like a long, exhausted sigh. No single cause explains it. Invasions, internal revolts, climate shifts, and economic fragility all take their turn in the blame game. You feel it as confusion. Orders stop coming, gates stay closed, fires aren't ceremonial anymore. You walk through ruins that still smell faintly of smoke. Once busy halls echo. The scribes are gone, the kings are gone, and with them goes the entire administrative memory of the world you just inhabited. It's unsettling, the way complexity can vanish so completely. You realize how thin civilization can be when it depends on a few interconnected systems staying upright at the same time. As night settles, you understand that this isn't the end of Greece, it's a shedding. The warrior kings fade, but the stories don't. They retreat into memory, into song, waiting for a future voice to gather them up and give them new shape. You lie back against a fallen stone, staring at stars that look indifferent but familiar, and let the noise of collapse soften into something distant. Sleep comes easier now, wrapped in the quiet after downfall, where echoes linger longer than walls. You don't notice the silence at first. It arrives gradually, like snow falling at night. One less ship in the harbor, one less fire on a hill. By the time you realize something is missing, the old noise is already gone. You're now moving through what later scholars will call the Greek Dark Age, roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, though it doesn't feel dark so much as quiet and inward-looking. The palaces are ruins. The walls that once promised safety now serve as convenient quarries for smaller homes. You live smaller now. Villages cluster near water and defensible hills. There's no Waynax issuing orders, no scribes counting jars of oil. Writing has slipped out of daily life entirely. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. For nearly 4 centuries, the Greek world uses no written records at all. Literacy disappears so completely that when writing returns, it does so in an entirely new form. You don't panic about this. You adapt. Humans always do. Without tablets and ledgers, memory becomes sacred again. You memorize genealogies the way later people memorize passwords. You repeat stories until they smooth themselves into rhythm. Meter matters. Repetition matters. This is how you protect the past from vanishing entirely. Around fires, you hear long tales of heroes who feel larger than life now. Achilles, Odysseus, names polished by generations of retelling. Whether they were ever real in the way you're real doesn't bother you much. Their truth is emotional, not administrative. You notice that iron begins to replace bronze. It's cheaper, more abundant, and less dependent on faraway trade routes. This shift is slow, uneven, and incredibly important. Historians still argue whether iron technology spread because of necessity after trade collapsed or because it was already waiting quietly in the background. Either way, it changes who can afford weapons. Warfare, once the domain of palace elites, becomes more local, more personal. Everyone knows someone who can fight. Your gods change too, or maybe they clarify. Zeus starts to feel more defined, Hera more temperamental, Athena more clever than cruel. Religion isn't centralized, it's intimate and fiercely local. Each village has its own version of the divine, its own sacred tree or spring. You don't argue theology, you argue which god helped whose harvest last year. Superstition fills the gaps where institutions used to be. There's a quirky detail that drifts past as you grow drowsier. Grave goods during this period become simpler, but cremation becomes more common in some regions. Some scholars think this reflects new ideas about purity in the soul. Others think it's just practical when land and resources are tight. Historians still argue whether this shift signals cultural influence from outside Greece or an internal reinvention. You shrug internally. Fire is faster. Ash is lighter. Despite the simplicity, something important is forming. You feel it in the way villages begin to identify themselves, not just by families, but by shared space. Hills, wells, fields, these become anchors of identity. You start to think in terms of us and them again, but on a smaller, more flexible scale than before. The seed of the polis, the city-state, is being planted quietly, without ceremony. Then, around the 8th century BCE, something remarkable happens. Writing returns. Not the old palace script, but a new system borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. You don't know it yet, but this alphabet will change everything. A mainstream historical fact slips in softly. The Greek alphabet is one of the first to include explicit vowels, making it easier to learn and far more versatile. Suddenly, writing isn't just for administrators. It's for poets, traders, and eventually, thinkers who won't shut up. The stories you've been carrying orally finally settle onto the page, or at least parts of them do. Someone, maybe Homer, maybe a tradition of singers we bundle into one name, gives the epics a more fixed form. The Iliad and the Odyssey aren't just entertainment, they're cultural glue. They teach values, caution against arrogance, and remind you that cleverness sometimes beats strength. You listen to these tales not as distant myths, but as maps for how to behave in a world that no longer guarantees safety. There's a scholarly debate murmuring in the background. Historians still argue whether Homer was a single poet, a compiler, or a convenient label for centuries of oral tradition. You don't care. The words work, they stick, they travel, and that's enough. As trade slowly revives, you encounter outsiders again, not as invaders, but as opportunities. You exchange pottery for metal, stories for spices. Greek communities scatter across the Mediterranean in early waves of colonization, from Asia Minor to southern Italy. These aren't empires. They're extensions of familiar habits, new homes carrying old gods. You begin to feel restless, in a good way. The quiet years have stretched your imagination. Without kings dictating meaning, you've learned to negotiate it. Disagreement doesn't feel dangerous anymore. It feels useful. Around communal gatherings, you argue about land, honor, and tradition. No one calls it politics yet, but it's warming up backstage. As night deepens, you sense the world stirring again. The silence has done its work. It preserved what mattered, stripped away what didn't, and made room for something louder, brighter, and far more argumentative. You lie back, listening to the crackle of a modest fire, and let the murmur of voices fade into a steady, comforting hum. The dark wasn't empty after all. It was patient. You feel the shift before anyone names it. The conversations get longer, the disagreements sharper. You're no longer just surviving alongside your neighbors, you're defining yourselves against them. By the time you reach the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Greek world has started stitching itself into something recognizable, not unified but structured. You live inside a polis now, a city-state, and it's more than a place. It's a personality. You wake each day surrounded by people who share your laws, your gods, and your grudges. The land immediately beyond your fields feels familiar. The next valley over feels suspicious. That's how identity works here. A mainstream historical fact drifts in easily. There are hundreds of Greek polis, each fiercely independent, each convinced it is doing civilization slightly better than the rest. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. Their names, yes, but more importantly, their attitudes. The polis grows from practical needs. You need shared defense, shared water, shared rules. Kings fade out almost everywhere, replaced by councils of elders, magistrates, or powerful families. This isn't equality. It's negotiation. You argue in open spaces, early agoras where trade, gossip, and politics blur together. The act of speaking publicly becomes a skill, then a weapon. Silence starts to feel like weakness. Law appears not as a gentle guide, but as a response to chaos. Blood feuds get old fast. Someone has to say, enough. In places like Athens, written law codes emerge, harsh and unforgettable. Draco's laws, for instance, are famously severe, so severe that centuries later, people will still use draconian as shorthand for excessive punishment. Historians still argue whether these laws reduced violence or simply relocated it into official channels. From your perspective, they're terrifying but stabilizing. At least now you know where the line is. There's a quirky detail that sneaks in as your mind softens. Early Greek law codes were sometimes displayed on rotating wooden boards, so citizens could literally turn the law around and read it. Transparency, but make it physically awkward. You smile at the thought, then let it drift away. Religion adapts to city life. Every polis chooses a patron god or goddess, someone to blame and praise equally. Temples rise, not just as sacred spaces, but as statements of civic pride. Festivals grow louder and more elaborate. You don't worship alone anymore. You worship together, in crowds, with music and wine and arguments about who's doing it wrong. The gods are still powerful, but they're also busy. You're expected to meet them halfway. Colonization accelerates. You board ships not because you're desperate, but because you're ambitious. Land is limited. Opportunities are not. Greek settlements pop up across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, carrying familiar layouts and familiar disputes with them. A scholarly murmur floats by. Historians still argue whether colonization relieved social pressure at home or simply exported it elsewhere. You suspect it did both. With expansion comes comparison. You encounter non-Greeks barbarians, a word that originally just means people whose language sounds like noise to you. Bar. It's less insult than confusion at first, but the distinction matters. Being Greek becomes less about blood and more about participation, speaking the language, honoring the gods, understanding the jokes. Culture, not genetics, draws the boundary. You notice armor changing too. Heavy bronze panoplies become standardized. Warfare becomes communal, disciplined. The hoplite phalanx emerges rows of citizens locking shields, trusting each other not to run. A mainstream historical fact settles in. This style of fighting reinforces the idea that the polis survives only if its members stand together. Individual glory matters less than cohesion. You don't fight for a king anymore. You fight for your neighbors. This changes how you think about responsibility. If the city fails, it's partly your fault. That's a heavy thought, but also an empowering one. Participation becomes expected. Avoiding public life starts to feel shameful. You're learning, slowly, that politics isn't optional. It's the background noise of adulthood. There's tension everywhere. Rich versus poor. Old families versus new money. Tradition versus adaptation. You hear talk of reformers, men who try to rebalance power, sometimes successfully, sometimes with blood on the stones. Tyrants rise in some cities, not always as villains, but as strongmen who promise order when compromise stalls. Historians still argue whether tyranny was a step backward or a necessary bridge toward broader political participation. From where you stand, it feels like holding your breath and hoping. As evening settles, you sit near the edge of the agora, listening to voices overlap and fade. Children chase each other between columns. Someone argues about taxes. Someone else sings badly but confidently. This is the sound of the polis being born, messy, loud, and impossible to put back in the box. You lie down with that noise, still echoing gently in your head. The city doesn't sleep all at once, and neither does the idea forming inside it. Tomorrow, someone will argue again, and somehow that will be progress. You feel the contrast the moment you arrive. Where Athens talks, Sparta watches. Where Athens argues, Sparta endures. The air itself seems quieter here, heavier, as if sound has learned to conserve energy. You're standing in Laconia now, and the land mirrors the people, rugged, restrained, unimpressed by flair. This is a place that doesn't care how clever your words are if your shield arm trembles. From childhood, everything here is preparation. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. Spartan boys enter the Agog around age 7, a state-run system designed to strip away softness and replace it with discipline. You watch them train barefoot, learning to fight, endure hunger, and obey without hesitation. Comfort is treated like a bad habit. Pain is just information. You notice how little is written down. Sparta distrusts excessive literacy, especially rhetoric. Words can be bent. Bodies, less so. Laws are attributed to Lycurgus, a semi-mythical lawgiver whose reforms supposedly shaped Spartan society for centuries. Historians still argue whether Lycurgus was a real person or a symbolic placeholder for gradual change. Either way, the system sticks rigid, repetitive, and remarkably stable. The city itself feels oddly unimpressive. No grand walls, no flashy temples. Sparta relies on its people to be the defense. You feel that confidence everywhere, humming under the surface. Wealth exists, but it's hidden. Gold and silver are discouraged. Iron bars serve as currency, inconvenient by design. A quirky tidbit drifts by. The iron money was intentionally heavy and brittle, making hoarding difficult and theft pointless. Minimalism, but make it terrifying. You start to understand that Spartan equality is narrow but intense. Among full male citizens, status differences are minimized. Everyone eats together in communal messes, sharing simple meals that taste mostly of salt and obligation. The infamous black broth sits steaming in bowls, meat, blood, vinegar. Outsiders hate it. Spartans pretend not to notice. You swallow slowly and tell yourself it's an acquired taste. Power here doesn't belong to one ruler. 2 kings lead armies, while councils of elders and elected officials balance authority. it's complex. Surprisingly so. Historians still argue whether Sparta was an oligarchy with democratic elements or a military state pretending to be traditional. From where you sit, it feels like a machine built to produce soldiers and suppress internal doubt. And suppression is necessary, because beneath everything lies fear. The Helots, an enslaved population forced to work the land, outnumber Spartan citizens significantly. This imbalance shapes everything. Annual declarations of war against the Helots make violence legally permissible. Young Spartans conduct secret patrols to intimidate and eliminate potential rebels. A fringe tidbit slips in quietly. Some ancient sources describe this system as one of the earliest examples of state-sponsored terror. You feel a chill despite the warm air. Women here stand differently than in other Greek cities. They train physically, manage households, and speak with startling directness. The logic is brutally simple. Strong women produce strong warriors. A mainstream historical fact lands softly. Spartan women own and control more property than women elsewhere in Greece. Freedom, but framed entirely around war. You compare this place to Athens without meaning to. One values speech, the other values silence. One celebrates innovation, the other perfects repetition. Neither feels entirely comfortable. Both feel effective in their own unsettling ways. Historians still argue whether Spartan rigidity ensured longevity or guaranteed eventual stagnation. You sense both outcomes coiled together like a held breath. As night settles, you sit near a quiet fire, listening not to laughter or debate, but to the steady sounds of maintenance sharpening blades, mending cloaks, preparing for a future that always looks like conflict. The stars overhead feel sharper here, as if even the sky has been disciplined. You lie down, body heavy, thoughts slowing. Sparta doesn't lull you with stories. It exhausts you into sleep, and somehow in that exhaustion the city finds exactly what it wants. You ease forward and feel the air grow crowded again. Not with people this time, but with presence. Everywhere you step, something unseen seems to be watching, listening, waiting to be acknowledged. In Greece, the gods are never abstract. They're close enough to offend, close enough to bargain with, close enough to blame when things go sideways. You don't believe in them the way later ages will debate belief. You live with them, the way you live with weather. You wake before dawn on a festival day. The city smells like incense, olive oil, and anticipation. Somewhere a goat is very nervous about how this morning is going to end. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Greek religion has no central scripture, no unified priesthood, no single correct version. What binds it together are shared stories, rituals, and an almost contractual relationship between humans and gods. You give, they might give back. No promises. The Olympians feel like a family you didn't choose. Zeus rules loudly and imperfectly. Hera remembers every slight. Athena watches carefully. Apollo brings music and plagues with equal calm. They're powerful, yes, but they're also deeply human in their flaws. That's comforting, in a strange way. If even gods make mistakes, yours feel less catastrophic. You join a procession moving toward a temple, feet shuffling in time, voices rising and falling in practiced chants. Religion here is public performance as much as private fear. Sacrifice is the language everyone understands. Smoke curls upward, carrying prayers with it. You don't expect miracles, you expect balance. Favor today, punishment tomorrow, if you forget your place. There's a quirky tidbit that drifts by like a half-remembered rumor. Some Greeks believed certain statues of gods could sweat, cry, or turn their heads when displeased. Whether anyone truly saw this or just swore they did is unclear. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect genuine belief, political manipulation, or the human talent for seeing what it expects to see. You keep your eyes respectful, just in case. Myth saturates everything. It explains geography, customs, even personality. A strange rock isn't just a rock, it's where a god landed, fought, or fell in love disastrously. A spring isn't just water, it's a nymph with moods. These stories aren't childish to you. They're maps layered over reality, giving meaning to randomness. When lightning strikes, you don't ask how, you ask who you annoyed. Oracles bridge the gap between divine and human confusion. You travel to Delphi, the air thinning as you climb. The priestess speaks in riddles, her words shaped by ritual and expectation. A mainstream historical fact slips in softly. City, states, and individuals alike consult oracles before wars, colonies, and major decisions. The ambiguity is the point. If the prophecy goes wrong, it's your interpretation that failed, not the god. You notice how religion seeps into art, theater, and sport. The Olympic Games aren't just competition, they're offerings in motion. Victories honor Zeus, cheating offends him. Athletes compete naked, partly for practicality, partly for aesthetics, and partly because shame works better without clothes. A fringe tidbit floats past. Women are barred from competing, but some own horses and technically win events anyway. The loopholes amuse you. There's tension here, too. Philosophers begin asking uncomfortable questions. What if the gods aren't just like us? What if nature follows rules that don't care about sacrifice? These ideas are whispered, not shouted. Impiety is dangerous. Historians still argue whether Greek religion suppressed free thought or unintentionally inspired it by presenting flawed deities open to critique. You feel that friction building quietly. At night, you lie beneath a sky crowded with stories. Every constellation is a reminder of divine drama. Heroes punished, lovers transformed, monsters memorialized in stars. Sleep comes with the sense that you're part of an ongoing conversation between earth and sky, one that doesn't require certainty, only attention. The gods don't demand perfection, they demand remembrance. And as your breathing slows, you realize that remembering them has taught you how to remember yourselves. You sense it before it arrives, like distant thunder carried on unfamiliar winds. The Greek world has spent generations arguing with itself, perfecting armor, polishing speeches, and now something vast is moving toward you from the east. It doesn't care about your city rivalries or your local gods. It comes with scale, confidence, and an assumption that resistance is temporary. You hear the name Persia, spoken with a mix of awe and disbelief. This isn't a city-state. It's an empire. Lands stretch from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, stitched together by roads, taxes, and a king who calls himself great without irony. A mainstream historical fact settles in. By the early 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire is the largest the world has yet seen. Compared to it, the Greek polis look like bickering villages. The first clash feels almost accidental. Greek cities in Asia Minor rebel. Athens helps. Persia remembers. The response comes in waves. When the Persians land at Marathon, you stand among hoplites who know they're outnumbered but not outmatched in discipline. The run toward the enemy is terrifying and brief. Shields lock, spears bite. Against expectation, the Greeks hold. The victory feels surreal, like waking up after a fall and realizing nothing's broken. There's a quirky tidbit that drifts through the aftermath. The legend of a messenger running from Marathon to Athens to announce victory before collapsing. Whether that exact run happened is debated. Historians still argue whether the story is later embellishment or symbolic shorthand for urgency. Either way, the idea sticks, sprinting straight into the future. The war doesn't end, it escalates. Xerxes arrives with an army, so large it feels like geography itself is marching. Bridges span seas, supplies move like clockwork. You watch Greek cities panic, argue, unite, fracture, and then, somehow, stand together just enough. At Thermopylae, you witness delay become defiance. A small force holds a narrow pass, knowing exactly how it will end. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly. The Spartans aren't alone there, but their sacrifice becomes the symbol. Stories prefer clean shapes. You retreat, you burn your own city. Athens empties, trusting wooden walls, ships over stone. At Salamis, the sea becomes an ally. Smaller Greek vessels outmaneuver Persian numbers. Confusion spreads. The impossible happens again. Victory doesn't feel triumphant. It feels relieving, like surviving a wave you thought would drown you. Historians still argue whether Greek unity in these wars was inevitable or a temporary miracle born of fear. You suspect fear did most of the work. But fear can be clarifying. For a moment, you know who you are because you know who you're not. As night falls, you sit among exhausted survivors. The empire has been pushed back, not destroyed. You understand this isn't the end of conflict. It's the beginning of confidence. And confidence, you're learning, can be just as dangerous as fear. Your breathing slows. The storm has passed for now. Sleep settles in, carrying the echo of oars striking water in unison. You wake into sunlight that feels earned. After invasion and fire, the Greek world stretches, exhales, and decides almost unanimously that survival deserves celebration. Wealth flows again, especially into Athens, and it shows. Stone replaces wood, art grows confident, ideas stop whispering and begin to perform. You're living inside what later generations will call a golden age, though you can already feel the hairline fractures under the shine. A mainstream historical fact settles in as naturally as breath. Athens leads the Delian League, an alliance formed to deter future Persian threats. The treasury begins as shared protection money. Over time, it quietly relocates to Athens. Contributions become mandatory. Ships become leverage. You notice how defense morphs into dominance without ever announcing the change. The city transforms before your eyes. The Acropolis rises, crowned with temples that look impossibly balanced, as if geometry itself learned restraint. The Parthenon gleams not white, as you might imagine, but painted in bold colors, now faded by time. Sculptures idealize the human form, not because people are perfect, but because perfection feels like a goal worth arguing with. You walk beneath columns and feel the strange confidence of a society that believes beauty is a civic duty. Philosophy spills into public life. You hear names repeated with a mix of reverence and irritation. Socrates, Anaxagoras, Protagoras. They ask questions that don't have clean answers. What is justice? Can virtue be taught? Does the universe care about human rules? These aren't late-night musings anymore. They're public sport. You watch arguments unfold in marketplaces, gymnasiums, and dinner parties. Winning isn't the point. Sharpness is. There's a quirky tidbit that drifts by as your eyelids grow heavy. Socrates never writes anything down. He claims writing weakens memory and understanding. Ironically, everything you know about him survives only because his students ignore that advice. Historians still argue whether the Socrates you meet through Plato is the man himself or a literary character shaped for argument. You listen anyway. The questions work, regardless of authorship. Drama becomes a civic mirror. You sit in vast open-air theaters as tragedies and comedies unfold. The stories are ancient, but the commentary is immediate. Hubris gets punished. Power gets mocked. Gods get questioned just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. A mainstream historical fact slips in gently. Attending theater is considered part of civic education in Athens, sometimes even subsidized by the state. Entertainment isn't an escape. It's a public examination. But the glow hides tension. Wealth from the empire fuels culture, and culture fuels pride. Allies begin to feel like subjects. Dissent grows. Sparta watches from a distance, unimpressed and increasingly uneasy. Historians still argue whether Athens could have restrained itself or whether empire inevitably demands expansion. From where you stand, restraint feels boring, and boredom is politically dangerous. Everywhere you go, you sense moral friction. Democracy thrives on participation, but participation takes time, and time favors those who have it. Slaves work so citizens can debate. Women manage households so men can philosophize. The contradiction hums quietly, never fully addressed. You feel it most sharply when someone praises freedom without noticing who's excluded. A plague arrives, uninvited and indifferent to culture. Bodies pile up, rituals fail, faith shakes. A mainstream historical fact lands softly but heavily. The Athenian plague kills a significant portion of the population, including Pericles, the city's most influential leader. Confidence falters. Rules bend. Fear slips back in through the cracks pride left behind. You watch Pericles speak before his death, praising Athenian values, openness, courage, participation. The words are beautiful. They're also heavy with expectation. Historians still argue whether his vision was achievable or aspirational propaganda. You feel both inspired and uneasy. Living up to ideals is harder when they're carved in stone. As night settles, you walk through streets that glow with lamplight and argument. The city is alive, brilliant, and tense. You lie down knowing this brilliance can't last forever, not because it's flawed, but because it's human. Sleep comes gently, wrapped in marble dust and unanswered questions. You feel the turn before it's announced. The laughter grows sharper. The jokes carry edges. Old allies start counting ships instead of favors. What once felt like confidence now feels like impatience, and impatience is rarely quiet for long. The Greek world, especially Athens and Sparta, has been circling itself like a thought that won't resolve. Eventually it breaks into motion. War doesn't arrive with surprise this time. It arrives with justification. Grievances are listed, alliances invoked, oaths remembered selectively. The Peloponnesian War begins not as a single explosion but as a long grind, a war of attrition between two ideas of how a city should live. A mainstream historical fact settles in slowly. This conflict will last nearly 3 decades, on and off, draining resources, trust, and optimism from both sides. You're in Athens when it starts, watching citizens vote for war with a confidence that feels rehearsed. The strategy seems sound: avoid land battles, rely on naval strength, let Sparta exhaust itself. You retreat behind walls and trust ships and money to do the work. At first, it almost feels boring, too easy. Then the plague returns, or maybe never really left, and boredom turns to terror. You move through crowded streets where sickness spreads faster than rumors, doctors fail, rituals collapse under the weight of bodies. People stop caring about laws they assume they won't live long enough to break again. A fringe tidbit drifts by like a bad dream. Some ancient observers note that during the plague, social norms eroded so badly that people spent inheritances meant for decades in days. When the future shrinks, patience goes with it. Outside the walls, the war becomes personal. Fields burn, farms vanish, the countryside empties. Inside, politics turns venomous. Leaders rise and fall quickly now. Accusations replace arguments. Someone is always to blame. Historians still argue whether democracy functions best in peace or whether crisis reveals its true strengths. From where you stand, crisis mostly reveals fear. Sparta adapts, slowly, stubbornly, effectively. They build a fleet with Persian money. Yes, the same Persia from before. Old enemies make practical friends. It's not betrayal, it's realism. A mainstream historical fact slides in quietly. The Peloponnesian War ends the brief moment when Greek cities pretend they won't involve outside powers in their rivalries. The door opens. It never really closes again. You witness moments of shocking cruelty. Cities that rebel are punished harshly. Neutrality becomes suspicious. There's a famous debate in Athens over what to do with a rebellious city. Arguments laid out coldly, almost mathematically. Mercy versus deterrence. Fear versus reputation. Historians still argue whether these debates reflect moral decline or brutal honesty finally spoken aloud. You feel your stomach tighten either way. And yet, the war isn't just darkness. There are pauses, treaties signed with crossed fingers, brief returns to normal life. You attend a play and notice how tragedy feels less metaphorical now. When characters suffer for pride, it doesn't feel distant. Comedy gets darker too, sharper, less patient with hypocrisy. Art doesn't escape the war, it metabolizes it. Then comes the gamble. Athens launches a massive expedition against Sicily, convinced that one bold move will solve everything. You watch the ships depart, bright with optimism and polished armor. It feels wrong in your chest, like cheering right before a fall. A mainstream historical fact settles heavily. The Sicilian expedition ends in catastrophic failure. Ships destroyed, soldiers captured or killed. The loss is not just military, it's psychological. Back home, trust collapses. Coups are attempted, democracy wobbles. Briefly, oligarchy takes its place. Then democracy returns, bruised but stubborn. Historians still argue whether this resilience proves the system's strength or its refusal to learn. You're too tired to judge. You just notice how familiar instability has become. Sparta wins, eventually. Athens surrenders. Walls come down. Ships are taken. The war ends not with triumph, but exhaustion. No one feels victorious. Greece as a whole is weaker now, poorer, angrier, and more vulnerable than before it began. The war that was supposed to prove superiority proves fragility instead. As night settles, you sit among ruins that don't feel ancient yet. They feel recent, like wounds that haven't decided whether to scar. You lie down knowing something has changed permanently. The idea that Greeks can endlessly argue and still win has been tested and found wanting. Sleep comes heavier now, weighted by the quiet after shouting stops. When you finally hear what's been lost, you don't feel victorious when the war ends. You feel hollowed out, like a house after a fire still standing, but smelling faintly of ash forever. Greece is quieter now, not peaceful, just tired. The old confidence has cracked, and through those cracks, something new is watching patiently. You notice it first in the north. Macedon has always been there, hovering at the edge of Greek attention like a cousin nobody takes seriously. Too rural, too rough, not quite Greek enough. But while the southern city-states exhaust themselves with arguments and betrayals, Macedon is learning, observing, adapting. And now, under a king named Philip, it steps forward. A mainstream historical fact settles into your thoughts without resistance. Philip II of Macedon transforms his kingdom into the dominant military power in Greece within a single generation. He doesn't just raise an army, he redesigns war itself. Longer spears, tighter formations, relentless drilling. You watch soldiers train until movement becomes instinct, not choice. Philip isn't just a warrior. He's a politician with scars. He uses marriages, bribes, threats, and patience in equal measure. Where Athens debates, Philip decides. Where Sparta endures, Philip advances. Greek city-states, weakened and suspicious of one another, underestimate him repeatedly. Historians still argue whether this blindness was arrogance or exhaustion. From where you stand, it feels like both. You attend assemblies where leaders argue about Macedon the way people argue about an approaching storm, acknowledging it exists while assuming it will somehow go around them. It doesn't. At Cheronea, everything changes. Greek forces unite at last, but too late, and not with full hearts. The battle is decisive. The old powers fall into line. There's a quiet, almost uncomfortable realization afterward. Greece hasn't been destroyed, it's been absorbed. Philip claims to lead Greece, not conquer it. He speaks of unity, revenge against Persia, shared glory. The language is familiar enough to be comforting, but the balance of power is gone. Independence becomes memory instead of practice. You feel it in the way voices lower when Macedonian officials pass. A quirky tidbit drifts through your tired mind. Philip loses an eye in battle and turns the injury into part of his legend. Coins, statues, he doesn't hide the damage. Power, here, doesn't require perfection. It requires survival. Then Philipdes, suddenly, violently, and the silence that follows feels sharp. His son steps forward. Alexander. He's young, frighteningly confident, and already convinced the world is waiting for him. You see something different in his eyes, not patience like his father, but momentum, a sense that standing still is a kind of death. Historians still argue whether Alexander was a strategic genius or a brilliant improviser carried by ambition. You suspect he doesn't care either way. The Greek cities consider rebellion, briefly. Then Alexander makes an example of Thebes. The destruction is total. The message is unmistakable. Resistance is no longer a debate. It's a risk with a visible price. As night falls, you sit with the uneasy truth settling in your chest. Greece didn't fall to an outsider who hated it. It fell to someone who admired it deeply and wanted to carry it everywhere. Sleep takes you slowly now, heavier than before. The world isn't ending. It's about to move very, very fast. You barely have time to adjust to the idea of Alexander before he's already moving. That's the first thing you learn about him. Stillness irritates him. Planning exists, yes, but only to clear the path for motion. The army doesn't wait for Greece to feel ready. It crosses the Hellespont in 334 BCE like a thought that has finally decided to act. You follow not because you're certain, but because everyone else is. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness as naturally as breathing. Alexander begins his campaign against Persia with a relatively small but highly disciplined force, relying on speed, coordination, and psychological shock rather than numbers. He visits the ruins of Troy first, offering sacrifices to Achilles. It's not subtle. He's aligning himself with myth on purpose, stepping into a story he believes has been waiting for him. Battles blur together at first. Granicus, Issus. You watch Persian satraps fall back in disbelief as Greek-style warfare slices through expectations. Alexander leads from the front, dangerously so. He fights like someone who doesn't expect to live long, or maybe like someone who expects to be remembered longer than anyone else. Historians still argue whether his courage inspired loyalty or recklessness. From where you stand, it does both, sometimes in the same afternoon. Cities react differently. Some resist and burn. Others open their gates and survive. Alexander can be merciful or annihilating, and the unpredictability becomes its own weapon. You notice how quickly stories spread ahead of the army, exaggerated, sharpened, terrifying. Reputation arrives before soldiers do. Egypt welcomes him like a correction. He's crowned pharaoh, adopts local customs, and founds a city bearing his name, as if permanence can be summoned by repetition. Alexandria rises not as conquest, but as projection, a vision of a world blended rather than erased. A quirky tidbit drifts by. He consults the oracle of Siwa in the desert, and whatever answer he receives, it convinces him he is more than human. Historians still argue whether the oracle called him divine or whether Alexander heard what he needed to hear. You notice how certainty settles into his posture afterward. Then comes Gaugamela. You stand on a vast plain where the Persian king Darius assembles everything the empire can offer: numbers, elephants, chariots, spectacle. The scale is intimidating, theatrical. Alexander responds not with caution but precision. The Macedonian phalanx holds. Cavalry cuts. Darius flees. Again, a mainstream historical fact lands heavily. This battle effectively ends Persian imperial power, even though resistance will continue. An empire doesn't collapse in a day, but its center can. Victory doesn't slow Alexander, it accelerates him. He moves east, deeper than anyone expects, chasing Darius, then chasing something harder to name. The army grows weary, supply lines stretch thin, landscapes change mountains, deserts, rivers that don't care about ambition. You feel the mood shift from exhilaration to endurance. Soldiers grumble, officers hesitate. Alexander listens, then pushes anyway. There's a scholarly debate humming beneath the exhaustion. Historians still argue whether Alexander had a clear end goal, or whether conquest itself became the objective. You sense the truth is messier. Stopping would mean deciding who he is without movement, and that question seems to frighten him more than any army. In Persia's former capitals, Alexander adopts elements of royal ceremony dress, gestures, expectations of deference. Some Macedonians bristle. Greek companions whisper about corruption, about forgetting where he came from. Alexander insists he's not becoming Persian, he's becoming universal. It sounds convincing if you say it fast enough. You witness moments of intimacy and rupture. Friends argue, friends die. At a drunken banquet, Alexander kills Clitus, a man who once saved his life, during a heated argument. The silence afterward is unbearable. A fringe tidbit drifts through your mind. Ancient sources describe Alexander weeping after the act, torn between rage and regret. Historians still argue whether this reveals guilt or simply frustration at being challenged. Either way, something fractures quietly. The march continues into lands that feel endless. Central Asia resists stubbornly. Guerrilla warfare replaces grand battles. Victory becomes slower, less glamorous. Alexander marries a local woman, Roxana, perhaps for love, perhaps for politics, perhaps because blending feels inevitable now. Cultures overlap, soldiers settle, children are born who belong to more than one world. Then India. The army reaches the edge of what maps can explain. Rivers swell, elephants tower. At the Hyphasis River, something finally stops Alexander, not an enemy, but his own men. They refuse to go farther. They've followed him to the end of everything they recognize. For the first time, Alexander yields. Not gracefully, but he yields. A mainstream historical fact settles softly. Alexander turns back, his empire already the largest the world has seen, though it doesn't yet know how to exist without him moving. The return journey is brutal. Heat, thirst, disease. Triumph feels distant now, like a story someone else told. As night settles, you lie beneath unfamiliar stars, listening to the army breathe in its sleep. You realize something important. The world has been changed not just by what Alexander conquered, but by what he connected. Ideas, languages, customs, all stirred together, whether anyone asked for it or not. Sleep comes slowly, carrying the weight of distance traveled and the uneasy sense that this story, like the man at its center, doesn't know how to end yet. You feel the end approaching before anyone names it. Alexander still moves, still plans, still talks about new campaigns, as if the world hasn't already bent around him, but the rhythm is off. Victories no longer feel like beginnings. They feel like aftershocks. The empire exists now vast, stitched together by roads, garrisons, marriages, and fear, but it doesn't quite know what to do with itself. You enter Babylon, a city that feels older than ambition itself. Its walls are broad, its rituals ancient, its gods unimpressed by youth. Alexander chooses it as a center, not because it's Greek, but because it isn't. That matters. A mainstream historical fact settles gently. Babylon becomes the administrative heart of Alexander's empire near the end of his life, a symbolic choice meant to unify East and West. You sense the intention. You also sense how fragile it is. Alexander talks of fusion now. Persian nobles join Macedonian officers. Greek language spreads, but local customs remain. He encourages intermarriage, shared dress, shared futures. Some embrace it. Others resent it deeply. You feel the tension at banquets where laughter sounds forced and old loyalties sit heavily at the table. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely believed in cultural unity or used it as a tool to govern more effectively. Watching him, you suspect belief and strategy have tangled beyond separation. Then the fever comes. It starts quietly: fatigue, warmth, irritation. Alexander ignores it, as he ignores most limits. Days pass. He weakens. The strongest man you've ever seen struggles to lift his arm. The army waits, stunned by the idea that movement itself might stop. A fringe tidbit drifts through the haze. Ancient sources disagree wildly on the cause of his death: malaria, typhoid, poisoning, complications from old wounds. Historians still argue, and likely always will. You only know that the room grows quiet. When asked who should inherit the empire, Alexander gives an answer that feels less like instruction and more like a riddle. To the strongest. Or maybe he says nothing at all. Accounts vary. Either way, clarity does not arrive. Alexander dies in 323 BCE, not yet 33. A mainstream historical fact lands with surprising softness. The largest empire the world has known suddenly belongs to no one. You don't feel shock so much as imbalance, like a weight has been lifted too quickly and the body hasn't caught up. The aftermath isn't immediate collapse. It's something messier. Generals, friends, rivals, survivors circle one another cautiously. These are the Diadochi, the successors, and they know exactly how dangerous each other is. Alliances form and shatter. Wars ignite, pause, and reignite. The empire fractures not because it's weak, but because it's too large to agree on how to exist. You watch the map change without moving. Egypt falls to Ptolemy, Asia to Seleucus, Macedon to Antigonus, then others. Borders harden, capitals shift. The dream of unity dissolves into practicality. Historians still argue whether Alexander's empire was ever meant to last or whether it was always a catalyst rather than a container. You suspect it was built for motion, not rest. And yet, something extraordinary survives the fracture. Greek language spreads farther than Greek armies ever did. Cities founded by Alexander and his successors become centers of learning, trade, and argument. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly. Koine Greek becomes the common language across much of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, enabling ideas to travel with unprecedented ease. Even in division, connection remains. You feel the world widen intellectually even as it narrows politically. Philosophies shift focus. Instead of asking how to build the perfect city, thinkers ask how to live well in any city. Stoics, Epicureans, Cynics. New schools emerge, concerned less with politics and more with inner stability. Historians still argue whether this turn reflects wisdom or withdrawal. You feel it as fatigue learning how to think about peace. As night settles, you walk through a city that speaks Greek but worships local gods, governed by a Macedonian elite ruling over an ancient population. It shouldn't work, and yet it does. Unevenly, creatively, stubbornly, you lie down realizing that Alexander didn't just conquer territory. He accelerated history. He blurred boundaries so thoroughly that going back becomes impossible. Whatever comes next will be built on mixture, not purity. Sleep takes you gently now, carrying echoes of marching feet that have finally stopped, leaving the world to figure out how to stand still on its own. You wake into a world that feels broader, flatter, and strangely more conversational. The shouting ambition of conquest has faded, replaced by the steady hum of trade, scholarship, and quiet competition between cities that now measure prestige less by walls and more by minds. This is the Hellenistic age, not unified, not peaceful, but deeply connected. You walk through Alexandria first, because everyone does eventually. The city feels designed rather than grown, laid out with intention, confidence, and a faint smell of ink and salt water. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. The Library of Alexandria aims to collect all known knowledge, or at least a copy of it, drawing texts from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Ships entering the harbor are searched not for weapons, but for books. Inside the Mausoleum, scholars argue gently, persistently, about everything. Mathematics stretches toward abstraction. Geometry becomes proof, not intuition. You hear Euclid's name spoken with the casual respect reserved for someone who rearranged reality slightly and then walked away. Astronomy inches forward. Earth is measured, not guessed. A fringe tidbit drifts by. Eratosthenes calculates the Earth's circumference using shadows and patience, getting remarkably close without ever leaving Egypt. Historians still argue whether later generations fully appreciated how radical this was. You do. You feel it in your bones. Philosophy turns inward. The old questions about perfect states feel naive now. You've seen how quickly states rise and fall. Instead, thinkers ask how to remain calm when the world refuses to cooperate. Stoicism teaches you to focus only on what you can control. Epicureanism suggests pleasure isn't excess, but the absence of pain and fear. Cynics reject comfort altogether, just to prove they can. Historians still argue whether this shift marks progress or retreat. You feel it as adaptation. Cities compete culturally now. Pergamon builds its own library, not entirely out of love of learning, partly out of rivalry. Sculpture becomes more expressive, wrinkled faces, strained muscles, imperfect bodies frozen in motion. Art no longer pretends everyone is heroic. It admits exhaustion, struggle, age. You recognize yourself in it more easily. Religion blends, quietly and persistently. Greek gods acquire foreign accents. Egyptian Isis gains Greek devotees. Eastern mysteries promise personal salvation rather than civic order. A mainstream historical fact slips in gently. Syncretism becomes a defining feature of the Hellenistic world as cultures merge rather than replace one another. Faith feels more personal now, less tied to citizenship. You notice something else too. Power has centralized again. Kings rule vast territories, supported by professional armies and bureaucracies. Participation shrinks. Politics feels distant, managed by someone else. In exchange, stability improves. Trade flourishes, roads hold. Pirates are discouraged, most of the time. Historians still argue whether people traded freedom for security, or whether freedom had already become impractical at this scale. You just notice that life feels quieter. Far to the west, another presence stirs. Rome watches, learns, adopts. Greek tutors educate Roman elites. Greek art fills Roman villas. Greek gods receive Latin names. You sense a slow gravitational pull, subtle but relentless. A quirky tidbit floats past. Some Romans deliberately speak Greek in intellectual settings to sound refined. Power doesn't always speak its own language. As night settles, you sit beneath a sky unchanged by libraries or empires. The stars remain patient. You realize that Greece hasn't vanished. It has diffused into language, science, habits of thought that now belong to more than one place. Sleep arrives easily here, surrounded by murmured arguments, turning pages, and the gentle certainty that ideas travel farther than armies ever could. You begin to notice how often Greek words follow Roman footsteps, not loudly, not as conquest, but as habit. Rome doesn't storm into the Greek world at first. It studies it, copies it, borrows from it with the quiet hunger of someone who knows power is coming but wants polish before it arrives. You're standing at the edge of a handover that pretends not to be one. Rome's rise feels practical rather than poetic. Where Greece argues about virtue, Rome codifies law. Where Greece debates ideals, Rome builds roads and expects them to last. And yet, beneath the discipline, admiration runs deep. A mainstream historical fact settles in smoothly. Roman elites are educated by Greek tutors, read Greek philosophy, and model much of their art, religion, and literature on Greek foundations. Conquest will come later. First comes imitation. Greek city-states, long fractured, now face a power that doesn't need their approval. Some resist. Some negotiate. Some welcome Roman order after centuries of instability. The wars are uneven, often anticlimactic. Macedonia falls. Corinth burns. Athens survives mostly on reputation. You feel the shift when decisions are no longer argued locally but answered with decrees from elsewhere. And yet, Greece doesn't feel erased. It feels installed. Roman temples house Greek gods with new names. Zeus becomes Jupiter. Aphrodite becomes Venus. The personalities barely change. A quirky tidbit drifts by. Romans sometimes consider Greek originals too sacred to alter, choosing instead to copy them obsessively. Power is comfortable admitting it didn't invent beauty. Philosophy travels west more easily than armies ever did. Stoicism, in particular, finds a second home in Rome. The idea that virtue lies in self-control appeals to administrators and generals alike. Historians still argue whether Roman Stoicism preserves Greek thought or transforms it into something sterner. You feel the difference in tone. The questions remain Greek. The answers start sounding Roman. Greek becomes the language of intellect across the Eastern Empire. Even as political independence fades, cultural authority lingers. Physicians, astronomers, engineers, many still think in Greek terms, even when paid in Roman coin. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly. The eastern half of the Roman Empire will continue speaking Greek for centuries, long after Latin dominates the West. You walk through a city where Roman soldiers patrol streets laid out centuries earlier by Greek planners. The layers don't cancel each other out, they coexist, sometimes uneasily, sometimes seamlessly. You realize that Greece has achieved something rare. It has lost control without losing influence. Historians still argue whether Roman rule marks the end of Greek history or its continuation by other means. You don't feel an ending. You feel diffusion. Greek ideas are no longer local possessions. They're tools anyone can pick up, adapt, misuse, or refine. As night settles, you lie back knowing something subtle but permanent has happened. Greece no longer needs to stand alone to matter. Its voice now speaks through others, in accents it never planned, shaping futures it will never see directly. Sleep comes gently, carrying the understanding that decline isn't always disappearance. Sometimes it's multiplication. You start to notice something unsettling and comforting at the same time. Greece is no longer a place you can point to. It's a habit of mind, a reflex, a way of asking questions even when answers are inconvenient. Long after city-states lose power, Greek thought keeps resurfacing wherever people slow down long enough to wonder why things are the way they are. You hear it in language first. Words slip into daily use so quietly they don't feel borrowed anymore. Logic, drama, politics, physics. A mainstream historical fact settles in without effort. An enormous portion of modern scientific, medical, and philosophical vocabulary traces directly back to Greek. Even when Rome rules, even when new empires rise, the thinking underneath keeps wearing Greek clothes. Education becomes the main carrier. Young elites across the Mediterranean study rhetoric, geometry, and philosophy using Greek models. To think clearly is to think like a Greek, or at least to pretend you do. You notice how arguments are structured now: premise, Counterpoint, conclusion. Disagreement isn't failure, it's a method. That idea refuses to die. There's a quirky detail that drifts through your half-sleeping mind. Ancient Greek textbooks on logic and rhetoric are still copied and recopied centuries later, sometimes with marginal notes from students complaining about difficulty. Even 2,000 years ago, someone was muttering, "This makes no sense," while studying Aristotle. Comforting, honestly. Science carries the torch unevenly. Some discoveries stall, others leap forward. Medicine, especially, keeps Greek fingerprints. Observation matters. Symptoms matter. Causes are debated rather than attributed solely to divine mood. Historians still argue whether Greek science truly broke from superstition or simply reorganized it more neatly. From where you stand, the difference feels practical enough to matter. You realize democracy doesn't travel as cleanly as philosophy. Most empires prefer efficiency to argument. Still, the idea lingers, like an unfinished sentence. People remember that once, somewhere, citizens gathered and decided things together, even if they argued badly and excluded many. That memory alone is disruptive. A mainstream historical fact hums softly. Later republics and revolutions will explicitly reference Greek political experiments, not as blueprints, but as proof that alternatives exist. Art preserves emotion better than systems ever could. Sculptures survive in fragments, but their influence survives whole. Balance, proportion, human-centered beauty. Even when artists rebel against these ideals, they do so knowingly. Greece becomes something to push against as much as something to admire. Religion changes completely around it. New faiths rise, offering certainty instead of debate, salvation instead of balance. And yet, Greek philosophy slips into theology anyway, shaping how people argue about God, the soul, and ethics. Historians still argue whether this was harmony or quiet takeover. You feel it as synthesis ideas merging whether anyone officially approves or not. As night settles, you sense that Greece has become a kind of mental landscape anyone can wander into. You don't need temples or armies anymore. You just need a question that refuses to sit still. You lie down with that realization warming you gently. Greece didn't survive by holding on. It survived by letting go, by teaching the world how to think, then trusting it to keep thinking without permission. Sleep deepens, steady and calm. As ideas drift past like familiar constellations you no longer need to name to recognize. You begin to feel the distance between then and now soften, like time deciding to sit beside you instead of towering overhead. Greek ideas don't arrive in later centuries as relics carried reverently in both hands. They arrive messily translated badly, misunderstood creatively, argued over fiercely, and yet they arrive anyway. Stubborn and adaptable, you pass through late antiquity into the medieval world, where monasteries glow faintly at night, preserving texts not because they're Greek, but because they're useful. Logic helps theology argue more precisely. Geometry helps builders reach higher without collapse. Medicine helps bodies last a little longer. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Many Greek works survive because they are copied, commented on, and taught continuously in Byzantine and Islamic centers of learning, even when Western Europe temporarily forgets them. Baghdad hums with scholarship. Damascus debates. Cordoba calculates. Greek philosophy and science pass through Arabic translation, gaining commentary, correction, and expansion. Aristotle wears a new accent. Galen's medicine is tested, criticized, refined. Historians still argue whether this transmission preserved Greek thought or transformed it beyond recognition. You feel the answer is both. Survival always changes things. There's a quirky tidbit that drifts past like a smile in the dark. Some medieval scholars know Greek thinkers only through layers of translation, Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin, and still manage to argue passionately about what Aristotle really meant. Even filtered through centuries, the arguments refuse to cool. Then the texts move again. Renaissance Europe rediscovers Greek originals, and suddenly the past feels startlingly alive. Artists study proportion. Architects measure harmony. Thinkers rediscover doubt as a tool rather than a threat. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly. The revival of Greek texts plays a key role in reshaping European education, science, and art during the Renaissance. Not because Greece had answers, but because it encouraged better questions. You notice something subtle shift. Authority becomes negotiable, tradition becomes discussable. If Aristotle can be questioned, so can kings. If Plato can be reinterpreted, so can scripture. Historians still argue whether Greek thought directly causes political revolutions or merely prepares minds to imagine them. You sense preparation is enough. Even modern science carries the echo. Hypotheses, experiments, peer disagreement. These aren't Greek inventions outright, but they resonate deeply with Greek habits of inquiry. You hear Socrates in every why, Aristotle in every classification, Euclid in every proof that refuses shortcuts. As night settles, you realize Greece has become temporal rather than geographic. It exists whenever someone chooses argument over silence, curiosity over comfort, reasoning over repetition. You don't need to remember dates or names to participate. You just need to stay awake to the question. You lie down with that thought easing your chest. The past isn't pulling you backward. It's sitting quietly beside you, sharing tools, then letting you sleep. You feel the story slowing now, not because it's running out, but because it's circling closer to you. The distance between ancient Greece and your own quiet room has narrowed to something almost touchable. You're no longer walking through ruins or libraries. You're noticing habits, mental reflexes that feel strangely familiar. You catch yourself doing it. Weighing two sides of an idea. Asking whether something is true, not just useful. Wondering how a good life should feel from the inside, not just how it should look from the outside. These aren't modern instincts. They're inherited. A mainstream historical fact settles gently. Modern education systems, especially in philosophy, science, and political theory, are still structured around Greek methods of questioning, categorizing, and debating. Even disagreement follows ancient rules. You see Greece in courtrooms where arguments matter more than volume. In classrooms where teachers don't just give answers but expect resistance. In science labs where certainty is always provisional. The Greek suspicion of absolute certainty survives remarkably well. Historians still argue whether this mindset leads to progress or paralysis. You feel both outcomes daily. There's a quirky detail that drifts by, almost playful. The word school comes from the Greek schale, meaning leisure or free time. Learning was something you did when survival pressures eased, not something squeezed into exhaustion. Somewhere along the way, that got flipped. The irony lingers. You notice Greek influence even in how stories are told. Tragedy still shapes modern drama. Heroes still fall because of pride. Comedies still mock power by exaggerating it. The structure feels natural because it's been rehearsed for thousands of years. You don't question it. You recognize it. Religion, too, carries faint Greek echoes even when it claims distance. The language of souls, ethics, reason, and virtue owes more to Athens than most sermons admit. Historians still argue whether this influence diluted faith or clarified it. You feel it as vocabulary tools for thinking about things too big to touch. Democracy remains unfinished everywhere it appears. Loud, messy, inconsistent, just like its earliest experiments. The idea that disagreement is not a flaw, but a feature traces directly back to dusty agoras and uncomfortable assemblies. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly. No modern democracy directly copies Athens, but nearly all reference it as a conceptual ancestor. The blueprint isn't reused. The permission is. As night settles, you realize something soothing. Greece doesn't demand loyalty. It doesn't ask to be defended or preserved exactly as it was. It only asks to be used, questioned, improved, even contradicted. That's how it survives, by refusing to freeze. You lie back, breathing slowly, thoughts stretching and then loosening their grip. The arguments fade into a gentle mental murmur, like distant voices in a cafe you don't need to join tonight. The story isn't ending, it's dissolving into you. You don't feel the need to hold everything together anymore. Dates, names, battles, they loosen their grip and drift outward, like constellations you no longer need to trace point by point. What remains is softer and more useful. Patterns, instincts, echoes. Greece settles into you not as a lesson, but as a rhythm. You notice how often thinking slows you down in a good way. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You turn an idea around once, then again, testing its weight. That pause is ancient. It's the same pause that once hung in the air before a question in the agora, before a response that might earn applause or laughter or silence. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly. Classical Greek education emphasized rhetoric and dialectic specifically to train this pause, the space between impulse and reason. You feel it now as calm. Memory does something strange as you grow sleepier. Events blur, but meaning sharpens. The rise and fall of cities matters less than the repeated human urge to explain the world, to argue about fairness, to build something that lasts longer than one lifetime. Historians still argue whether ancient Greece mattered because of its achievements or because of its attitude toward uncertainty. You suspect it's the second. Certainty gets old. Questions age better. There's a quirky detail that floats through your half-dreaming mind. Ancient Greeks often personified abstract concepts: victory, sleep, chaos as gods. Even sleep had a name: hypnos, gentle and unavoidable. It's fitting. You've been circling him all night without realizing it, letting stories do what arguments can't. You think back without effort now to kings who fell, cities that argued themselves into exhaustion, an empire that moved too fast to stay intact. None of it feels tragic anymore. It feels instructional, not in a preachy way, in the quiet way experience teaches. When it stops demanding attention and simply waits to be remembered later, you realize Greece never promised comfort. It promised engagement, and engagement, when you've had enough of it, naturally gives way to rest. The mind can only question so long before it wants to dream instead. As night deepens, the edges of the story soften. Alexander's footsteps fade into the background hum of time. Philosophers stop mid-sentence. Libraries dim their lamps. Even the arguments agree to pause. A scholarly debate lingers faintly. Historians still argue whether Greece's greatest legacy is freedom of thought or disciplined reasoning. But the answer no longer feels urgent. You don't need to resolve it tonight. You lie back fully now, breathing slow and even. The story has done its work. It has carried you across centuries, not to impress you, but to gently tire the parts of your mind that insist on staying awake. Thoughts stretch, then release. Sleep doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives politely, like it's been waiting for permission all along. You're no longer traveling forward through time now. You're drifting inward. The grand arcs of history have done their work, and what's left feels personal, quiet, almost weightless. Greece has stepped back, not because it's finished speaking, but because it trusts you to carry the echo without supervision. You notice how easily the ancient world fits into the background of your own life, not as facts to recall, but as instincts you barely notice anymore. The habit of questioning a headline, the instinct to debate an idea rather than accept it whole, the quiet respect for balance between reason and emotion, ambition and restraint. These are not modern inventions, they're old companions. A mainstream historical fact settles gently, like a final bookmark. Ancient Greek texts remain among the most continuously studied works in human history, read, retranslated, and reinterpreted for over 2 millennia. Not because they're perfect, because they're incomplete in interesting ways. They leave room for you. You think back to the city's Athens arguing itself hoarse, Sparta standing silently, Alexandria measuring shadows, Rome borrowing everything it admired. None of them feel distant now. They feel like earlier drafts of the same long conversation. Historians still argue whether Greece was exceptional or simply lucky in timing and transmission. You feel the answer doesn't matter much anymore. Influence isn't about purity, it's about persistence. There's a quirky detail that floats up one last time, gentle and almost playful. Ancient Greeks believed memory itself was divine, personified as Mnemosyne, mother of the muses. Art, history, song all born from remembering. It makes sense. Tonight, remembering has been the path toward rest, not effort. You realize the story has slowly stopped asking for attention. It no longer needs you to follow, analyze, or agree. It's content to sit beside you, like an old idea that knows it will resurface later when you need it, unannounced and familiar. Your breathing evens out. The need to connect dots fades. The questions that once felt sharp soften into background hum. Greece, once loud with debate and ambition, has become something quieter, an undertone rather than a melody. You let it be that. The night is doing what nights are supposed to do. Holding you, slowing you, letting thought dissolve into something less structured and more kind. Sleep is very close now. The pace eases completely now. There's nothing left to follow, nothing left to remember on purpose. The long road from Bronze Age shores to quiet modern thoughts gently fades into a single, steady feeling of calm. You're safe where you are. The lights are low. The world outside your room continues on without needing you to supervise it. If images still drift through your mind, they soften marble turning warm, voices lowering, waves slowing their rhythm. The arguments that once mattered so much dissolve into murmurs, then into silence. Even the questions relax, content to wait for another day. Your body knows what to do now. Shoulders loosen, jaw unclenches, breathing settles into an easy, natural rhythm, slow in, slower out. Nothing is required of you, not curiosity, not attention, not effort. History doesn't need to be held together anymore. It can rest. You can rest. Thoughts may still appear, but they pass without grabbing you. Like clouds crossing a dark sky, they move on their own. You don't need to follow them. You don't need to finish them. With each breath, the room feels quieter, heavier in a comforting way, like being gently tucked in by the night itself. Sleep isn't something you have to reach for. It's already here, waiting patiently. Let the last traces of story fade. Let memory soften into warmth. Let the present moment stretch and blur. Nothing else is coming. Nothing else is needed. Just rest now. Sweet dreams.